All right, before we get started in James, let's pray. Lord, we're here another week, just worshiping you. I thank you for the worship team and the time we had this morning. And Lord, as we dive in your word, I just pray you'd be with us as we dig in and that you would open our hearts to this passage of Scripture today. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so we're in James, chapter 1, and we're going to recap a little bit. And we've been coming along, and the book of James is a very action-oriented, practical book. And one of the things that we need to know is that this is one of the first, if not the first, I'm not going to get, wrestle about it, but it's one of the first New Testament books, right? Most likely before 50 A.D., okay, so this is one of the first ones that comes out, right? As Jews are understanding Jesus and his resurrection and what this means in the fulfillment of Scriptures, right? This is the first one that's like, okay, these are the things we need to know, right? This is important. So as we read this, we got to remember, okay, so this was important. This is the first news that needed to come out in the Christian life. And what we've done is we've seen that trials come in life, right? There's various trials that come. And last week, we looked at an illustration that our life is like building an engineered fill. And I know it was exciting for me, not so much for you. But we learned that to properly build an engineered fill, we have to remove all the stuff that can rot, right? All the roots and stuff. That can't be in there because if it rots, it leaves a void. And the house will settle. And the other thing is that it needs to be moisture conditioned, right? We've got to have a certain amount of moisture. And we also have to make sure that there's not too big of rocks or too little of rocks when we go to put it all back together. But if the conditions are just right, what happens is we put compactive effort on it, and we get to a point where the fill is placed so compactly that when a load is placed on it, it's no longer affected, right? And we had that illustration of up here with the pedals, right? And there was someone that was going to push all the pedals for one of the guys that leads worship up here, and he was like, hey, go ahead. It doesn't matter because I have a preset on there and they all go back. And so the one that was like, I'm going to mess with you, was like, oh, well, I can't do anything, right? Because he's not affected, right? The guy with the pedals is no longer affected, so there's no reason to hassle him. And we see that in our Christian life, right? In our lives, we move along, and this is important, and it's so important that there is an amount of conditioning that has to occur when you're building this fill in order for it to compact correctly. Because if you just take soil, right, and you go and you pound it, right, and just pound it, and it's not properly conditioned, it doesn't get compacted, right? It's a waste of crisis. And how does that work in the Christian walk? Well, the way it works in the Christian walk is if we're not properly conditioned, right, spiritually, trials will come. And guess what? They'll come again. And guess what? They'll come again, and nothing happens, right? We're still in crisis mode. But if we're properly conditioned spiritually, and that's what we've been seeing as we go through here, right? With proper conditioning spiritually, when these trials come, yeah, they kind of, right? But then it firms us up in our faith. And when we're firmed up in our faith, we get to a point where a trial comes, and we don't even realize it's a trial, right? Because it's like it doesn't affect us anymore. And so as we've been going through here, we've noticed that James seems like he's writing a book like Proverbs. And a lot of scholars have said that, James is writing in the same style as like Proverbs, right? Because he talks about trials, and then the next thing he talks about is every good and perfect gift, right? And then he talks about desiring wisdom. And it seems like he's jumping around, but my contention is that as he's doing this, these are all interrelated, and they're interrelated in that that's how we condition our spirit, right? We seek wisdom, right? Because sometimes trials come, and it's because of our own stupidity, right? So we ask for wisdom to deal with life and not do stupid things. And it says that we need to remain steadfast, and we're going to receive a crown, okay? And then it talks about, don't be deceived. Every good and perfect gift comes from the Father above. And we talked about how, yes, the glass can be. Did anybody notice the glass last time turned green? Yes. Is that weird? Yeah, okay. Just seeing if you're awake. Okay, so the glass is both half full and half empty, right? And we learned that both are true, right? And the same thing happens spiritually, because sometimes these trials come, and it'll be like the devil trying to trip us up, right? Trying to make us stumble and fail and get discouraged. But God also can use those, right? He can use those if we're properly conditioned. And so it's a matter of perspective. And, I told the story about when we went to Death Valley and how, for me, it was a fantastic adventure. For other members of my family, it was, one of the worst experiences in their life, right? And I will tell you, if one of you came up to me today after service and said, hey, you know what? If we traveled 3 hours to Eastern Oregon and we spent the night in the truck, there'd be a great chance that we could see a B-1B bomber do a flyover. I'd be with you, right? But don't expect my wife to go on that trip, right? The point is that things happen, right? And it's your perspective on the end result, okay? And when trials come in our lives, we can be like, oh, God hates me. No. And that's going to be your default. When you hear that voice that, oh, something horrible's happened, it's not because God hates you. It's God's starting to work on you, right? He's giving you that, oh, maybe it's time for a proof roll. And we're going to see a little bit more about the proof roll, but let's jump in here. It says in verse 19, so that was the back story. Now we're in verse 19. It says, know this, my beloved brethren, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. For the anger of a man does not produce the righteousness of God. Therefore, put away all filthiness and rampant wickedness, and receive with meekness the implanted word, which is able to save your souls. Okay. Well, guess what? Mill story. Now, this mill story is not one of my favorite mill stories, okay? And you're going to find out why. So I worked at this lumber mill, as most of you know, and I'd worked there, probably a couple years. And, it's a mill. And we often joked about the mill mentality, and there were certain things that were said, NSFW, right? Not safe for work. Okay, that generally doesn't apply to the mill, because at the mill there were all kinds of things that went on that you were just like, Well, one day at the mill, right, we're doing our thing, and one of the guys is NSFWing, right? And it's just like, oh man, getting weary of this. And anyway, we go on break, and I come in there and sit down, and this guy's rambling on. And I'd had enough. So what I did was I NSFW'd back, right? And it's, like in that Christmas story where the little, what's his name? Ralphie, says the bad words. Well, bad words spewed out of my mouth. And it was, in one instance, it was kind of neat because it was really quiet, right? Because, right, everybody was just like, right? And I was like, and I'm sitting there, right? And then it doesn't take long, okay? And the good news is it didn't take long. And I'm like, oh, Lord, I kind of screwed that one up. And I'm like, I'm sorry, Lord. And I'm dealing with this. I'm like, yeah, very unbecoming. But it ties into what we're saying here, right? Let every person be quick to hear and slow to speak and slow to anger. Well, I wasn't slow to speak and I wasn't slow to anger, right? Because you hear something and you get to that point, right? And you're right on that edge, right? And I'm just about ready to go off the rails, right? Well, old Kevin went off the rails. And so I'm sitting there, and I'm like, oh, Lord, it wasn't good, right? For an instance, you're like, yeah, look at that. Look at that. I can keep up with them, And then, the Lord's like, yeah, you proud of that? I'm like, well, no, I'm not proud of that at all. And so, I'm reconciled to God, and so I'm going back to pull chain, right? Breaks over, and it comes in my head, okay, and just understand that it's not an audible voice that I'm hearing God, but, the Lord's like, you need to apologize to him. And I'm like, no, I don't want to do that. I'm like, of all the guys that I work with, this guy, and so some of the guys have good stories at ending, and this guy's story is not so good ending. And his name was Larry. Okay, so and I can say Larry because Larry is no longer with us. And to my knowledge, Larry never accepted the Lord. But Larry was a lot of. There's a lot of Larry stories, and literally they're not safe for work. Okay, and so they're not safe for here for sure. And so you just kind of. And so what happened is I'm going back and I'm pulling chain for the next couple hours, and the Lord's like, yeah, you need to apologize to Larry. And I'm like, Lord, I don't want to apologize to Larry. And we're kind of having a discussion there in my mind, Lord, praying about it. And the Lord basically says, I'm not the one that said something stupid. And so I did. I went and I apologized to Larry. And it was hard. It was like, gee, Larry, I needed. And so anyway, I reconciled with Larry and life went on. However, that's one of those moments in life where, for one, you sit there and you go, oh, I see. That's why this stuff's in here, right? Right? Because it says that you need to be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. And it's like, okay, if I had taken that to heart, right, that would have helped. But I didn't, right? You can say, well, you slipped up, whatever, right? It's certainly a default in my character. Now, you want to know something exciting? Is, since that time, which has been over 25 years, I have not went NSFW on any coworker since. Right? Right? And so that's what happens. Yeah, we stumble, we fall, we do something stupid, but if you can pick up and go, oh, okay. And the reason I think that this has to do with trials and tribulation is because as we go through life, we have these trials, right? And stuff happens and we get angry, right? And here he points out that we need to control our tongue. And it's like, control your tongue? What does it have to do with deep spiritual things? Well, it's kind of like the movie, right? Wax on, wax off, right? We all know that modern reference. Well, I guess it's not modern anymore. All right. But you know what I'm saying, right? It was the Karate Kid movie where he wanted to learn karate, and the sensei was telling him to wax and dry the car, and he had to do it a certain way. And it turns out that those motions were the same motions that get used in his martial arts. And what was he doing? Oh, it's a Karate Kid. Ha 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 ha. Thanks. Okay. Thanks. Okay. So anyway, the same thing happens though here in our lives, right? Once we, and certainly the example that your mother used was, you have 2 ears and 1 mouth, so you should listen twice as much as you talk, right? And just an interesting note, right? The mouth, you can easily close, right? You can shut that pretty easy, right? Your eyes, right? You can see stuff, okay? And when you see something new, you can, right? But you know what? To shut the hearing off takes a little extra effort, right? You got to stick your fingers in there. So we should be listening a lot more than we're seeing and talking about, I guess is what I'm getting at. And anyway, in 21, he says, therefore, put away the filthiness, right? That's that NSFW stuff. And rampant wickedness, and receive with meekness the implanted word, which is able to save your souls. And so this word, right, as we read it, it comes in to us, right? And it does make a difference. And like I said, maybe you slip up. I have. Yeah, we'll just leave that at that. We don't need another story. It says, going on, it says, but be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man who looks intently at his natural face in a mirror. So he says, be doers of the word and not hearers only. And what happens, especially now, right? And I say especially now, is because of the podcast, right? Because now there's just so much teaching available, right? You can hear the word, night and day. You can be, in fact, I just found this YouTube channel where this guy has, through the Bible teachings of probably a dozen different pastors, right? And it's all in one location. So you can hear, and I was listening to J. Vernon McGee. Anybody J. Vernon McGee fans? Yeah, all right. And so, but I mean, on this same site was on the same YouTube page were all these guys, it's all there. And you kind of become a connoisseur of the different teachings. And what happens is it says you got to be doers and not just hearers only. And as you hear that, it's like, doers and not hearers. And where people get into trouble with the book of James is it starts to sound like it's works-based, right? But we know that it's not works-based, right? Our faith is not works-based, but we need to be doers. So what does that look like? And well, it's at this point, as we go through the book of James, that the story of Charles Blondin pops up. Charles Blondin. Is that ringing a bell? Well, I had a few with J. Vernon McGee, but we do have one. Okay, and that's because this guy is a classic. Okay, he's a classic, and you may not know his name, Charles Blondin, but there's a good chance you've heard the story. And Charles Blondin was kind of a daredevil. Okay, and his claim to fame was back in 1859, right? Even before my time. But in 1859, this guy, he had a rope across Niagara Falls. Right? Now some of you probably remember this story, right? And so this guy, he'd walk across the tightrope above Niagara Falls, and crowds would gather around. And he'd walk across blindfolded. And one time he walked across carrying a stove and cooking an omelet, right? On a tightrope over Niagara Falls. Right? So, okay. Well, one day he gets up there with a wheelbarrow, right? And he walks across with a wheelbarrow. And then he walks back, the big crowd there. And they're like, do you believe I can walk across Niagara Falls on a tightrope with somebody in the wheelbarrow? And they all said, yes, yes, yes. And he's like, give me a volunteer. Right? Right? And so what happens, guess how many people volunteered? Zero, right? Nobody volunteered. Okay, well, that's what the book of James is about. It's like, oh yeah, sure, Lord, we believe. Well, okay, we're not getting in the wheelbarrow per se, but we're getting out there and we're doing things. Okay, and that's what this, when he talks about be doers, that we need to do things, and it's not because, well, that's what makes us a Christian. No, we do things because we are Christians. And it's interesting when you hear that, be doers of the word, because you might go, that sounds familiar. Well, here's why it sounds familiar. If we go and we look in the book of Matthew, Sermon on the Mount, right? We've all heard the Sermon on the Mount, right? It starts with the Beatitudes, okay? And that starts in Matthew 5, and it goes all the way to Matthew 7, the end of Matthew 7. Now check this out. At the end of Matthew 7, verse 24, and this is Jesus speaking. He says, everyone, then, who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. Okay, small footnote there. Okay, some of you may be tracking, oh, there's a construction project, and it needs to be on sound material, which is exactly right. Jesus goes on, he says, and then the rain fell, and the flood came, and the wind blew, and it beat on the house, but it did not fall, because it was founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like the foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against the house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it. So here's the Beatitudes, or the Sermon on the Mount starts with the Beatitudes, and it talks about a whole bunch of stuff you're doing, okay? And here's Jesus saying that, yeah, you need to be the one that does stuff, because if you believe it, then you're going to do it, right? If I believed that in the corner of the lot over there was a rock with a case in it, and there was a bunch of gold coins, right? What would I do? Well, I'd go dig it up, right? If I believed it, right, I'd take some action. Now, I might be wrong in my belief, because I'm sure there's no gold coins in the corner of the lot, but you know what I'm saying is that if you believe something, you're going to act on it. And in the Christian walk, it's the same thing. And Jesus, clearly, the rock that Jesus is referring to is him, right? Right? We build ourselves on that faith, okay, which is Jesus. That's firm and solid. But it does tie into the illustration I've been trying to make, and that is, as we go through life, right, we're but dust, and God uses us, right, in all our weakness and frailty. And in Jesus' illustration, is when the house was built on the rock, the weather came, right? All the trials and tribulations came, but the rock didn't realize that anything was going on, right? Because it's a rock. But you know what I mean, okay? But when it's on the sand, right, and we know that if we just compacted sand, it wouldn't have worked anyway, because there needs to be some conditioning. So what happens, same thing here in our lives. If you don't, okay, let's go back to the mill story. If I'm at the mill and I just mouth off, right, and I don't let the Lord, cut me to the quick and work on my character, then that was all for naught, right? You know what that means? If you don't allow the Spirit of God to work in you, what happens the next time? You'll be even quicker to mouth off, right? And it's like, oh, you're not making any headway. So what happens is, as Christians, we want to be conformed to the image and nature of God. That's what our plan. No, are we going to be God? No, but we're going to conform to his image, what he's like. And what happens so often is we think, and I've given this illustration before, so bear with me if you've heard it, but we tend to think, it's a lot easier to think that all potato chips should look like Pringles, right? Right, because they're all the same shape, right? And from a marketing and supply standpoint, they fit in that container, and they're all perfect, right? And when you open it up, right, when you pop it up, my grandkids were eating them, right? When you open it up, they're right at the top. If you open a bag of regular potato chips, what do you see? Yeah, there's a bag, and there's just a few at the bottom. But the point is that real potato chips, right, are the ones that are cut, and then they're deep fried in the oil, and they all sizzle up, and they look different, right? And yeah, okay, so they fill that bag full of, nitrogen, so there's no oxygen, so they last longer, and then it's full, so it doesn't compress. The point is that as we go through life, we want to be conformed to the image of God. But just because somebody doesn't look like me doesn't mean they're not a Christian, right? Doesn't mean they're not a good, tasty Christian. You know what I'm saying? Right? Anyway. You get what I hope you get what I'm trying to say, is that we don't all have to look exactly the same. Right? When I was a kid, and I've told you this before, I've got relatives that own potato farm, and those potatoes that get used for Pringles, right, are called processors. And so what they are is the reject potatoes out of the packing house, and if the processing plant that makes those kind of products doesn't take it, then they go straight to the feedlot. And back in the day, a box of potatoes was like, going for $15 a box, 50-pound box, right? And those potatoes that you make Pringles out of, they were going for like $5 a ton, right? So that tainted me for a long time. Yes, there was a time when I did eat Pringles, but now they have too many carbs. All right, moving on. Sorry, I digressed. Man. Okay, but listen, it says, moving on, verse 23, it says, "For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man who looks intently at his natural face in the mirror. For he looks at himself and he goes away at once and forgets what he was like." So, what happens is if we just listen to teaching and we don't process and work it in our lives, then we're like the person that looks in the mirror, right? And let's use my illustration, right? I mouth off, very unChrist-like activity, right? You go home and you look in the mirror and you're like, did you do your best today, Kevin? No. Did you screw up? Yeah. And you got to do something about it, right? You got to do something about it. Because if you don't, it was like, why bother? Right? It's like that soil that's not properly conditioned. It gets pounded and pounded and pounded and pounded, but there's no change. And it can't change, right? Because maybe it has roots in it. Maybe it doesn't have enough water, right? Same thing in our life. If you're going to go through life, well, you're all living here today, right? So we're going through life together. And if you're going through it, you might as well, Lord, use it to shape me and form me into something that can be a strong foundation to be built upon. And that's what that looking in the mirror is all about. It's not like, and it's kind of weird and creepy if you see someone looking in the mirror and they're, doing the whole, right? And I think it's more, I'd like you to think of it like this. It's not like just looking in the mirror and going, oh yeah, more wrinkles here. Oh, more gray here, right? Oh, gray and saggy down here. Yeah, we got all that. But it is also looking in the mirror and saying, yeah, okay, Lord, right? It's looking inside. I think is the mirror he's talking about. It's an illustration, an allegory, right? If you look in that mirror, and this is one of the things, and I've told this story before, but I'm going to tell it again. My daughter Hannah was at a private school, okay? And she was in third grade, and she was having a spelling, they had weekly spelling, right? Does everybody remember the weekly spelling story? Yeah. Well, yeah, Jim does because he's heard a lot of the stories over and over. Anyway, so what happens is these words were hard, okay? And you ask yourself, science asks itself, is, the rearing of children, is it genetic? Is it environment? What? Okay, well, my daughter has a genetic predisposition from her father to spell poorly, and so that's also a environmental condition to spell poorly, right? And so she's spelling poorly. And there's a lot of debate going on about what to do about her spelling poorly. And I said, Hannah, oops, is it okay to say names? I guess it is. Neither of them are here, so it's okay. So it was the oldest daughter. And so I'm like, hey, Hannah, honey, I'm like, look. And she got like a D. And these, like I said, these words were pretty gnarly. And I said, look, honey, you got a D. I'm like, I don't spell well myself either. Okay, I don't. But you know what? Is that the best you could do? I mean, did you do your best? And that's all I can ask. I'm like, because if you did your absolute best and you suck at spelling, well, you suck at spelling. And the thing is today, there's so much, spell check, right? That even bites the people that can spell, right? You type wrong and it puts the wrong word in there. But I said, is that the best you can do? And she's like, no. And I'm like, honey, when you come home, you take your spelling test, I just want you to look in the mirror, and I did say this, look in the mirror and say, hey, I did my best. And that's all I can ask for, right? I don't want you to get A's. I want you to do your best. And mean it, right? And so, long story short, she makes it to, was it 8th grade? Yeah. So she goes through school, and because there was talk in the family, oh, you know what, you should go talk to that teacher, and you should be one of those parents that tells them the words are too hard and they need to give your children easier words, right? And I'm like, and because Hannah, she's like, well, maybe I should get easier words. I'm like, honey, would you feel better? Would you really feel better if they gave you, is, as, was, right? Give you those words to spell and you got an A? Would you feel good about that? I'm like, I'd feel a lot better if you got a C, doing your best with the hard words than if you got an A with easy words, right? So it was a long, drawn-out thing. Here's the punchline to that. Punchline is 8th grade, they had a regional spelling competition, and guess who from her school went to represent her school? It was Hannah, right? So she was able to go through her elementary school career, and she actually became a decent speller. Okay? And the ironic thing, or that's not ironic. It was one of those moments because next daughter comes up through the school, 3rd grade, same teacher, right? And you hear, as a dad, you listen in at the room, right? And you hear Hannah going, "Look, Beth, those words are hard. They are. But would you want them to lower the bar so you could get a better grade? No, you wouldn't. You need to do your best," right? And you're like, "Oh, wow." And so, certainly I had that same talk about spelling with Beth, right? And most of you know that daughter, right? The blonde one. Well, here's something that's, I think, kind of funny. No, I don't know why it's funny, but it is. So Beth is a school teacher now, right? And she teaches at a private school here in town. Somebody's going to say, "Wait, is she working for the Pope?" Yes, she teaches at St. Mary, okay? And so, sorry, that's just how it is. And we can talk about that afterward if you want. But she says every year now, and she teaches 5th grade, and she says, "Listen, I don't care if you all get A's. I want you to do your best," right? And it doesn't matter because here's the deal. And here is the deal, right? Say that you're a kid that's naturally good at spelling, okay? And if your goal is simply to get A's, you could still be bored out of your gourd, right? But if it's, "I'm going to do my best," that sets up a different parameter. And that's what she does with her kids, right? So now every kid that goes through the St. Mary's there in the 5th grade gets the lecture that I gave my daughter, 30 years ago, right? And I think that's what this whole thing about the mirror is here, that you know what? When we go home at night, you look in that mirror before you go to bed, and it's like, Lord, I did the best I could today. And where I messed up, right? I messed up one time. Well, oh geez, that sounds bad. One of the times I messed up, that sounds more accurate, right? It's like you got to come and you got to reconcile and say, "Yeah, Lord, use that." And he did, right? Because now I do a lot better with NSFW language, right? And also anger. And that's where that wisdom and minding your tongue ties in with trials and tribulation. Because once you get the ability and the skill set, right, to control that, things are going to go better for you. Verse 24, it says, "For if he looks at himself and goes away and forgets what he was like, but the one who looks into the perfect law," now check this out, "one who looks into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and preserves, being no hearer but forgets, a doer who acts, he will be a blessing in his doing," right? So what's that saying is, remember, this book was one of the early Christian books, right? So was it Christian or Jewish, right? Because we know that it was sent to the tribes, right? So it's kind of it's a transition book, right? It's the first one. And he says that whoever looks into the perfect law, the law of liberty, right? So he's talking about Old Testament, right? And even in the Old Testament, there's that law of liberty. It's liberty, right? We're free in Christ. And he says that whoever, looks at it and sees what's going on and makes a change, it says he will be a blessing in his doing. Now check this out. Verse 26, and we're about to wrap up, so you made it this far. Hang in there. It says, "If anyone thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his heart, this person's religion is worthless," right? And so here's that, and we're going to get more of the tongue stuff, so in chapter 3, so there's still going to be more of it. But here, it ties into this character of Christians that we are as we go through life, that one of the things we need to do is bridle our tongue. And it's so easy, right? Because, I showed you can go. You actually have to make effort to make words. And so in our Christian walk, once we get this ability to, because things can fly off the tongue pretty quick, right? And that kind of comes natural for me in a bad way, right? Because I can mouth off with the best of them. And as you know, you look in the mirror and you're like, oh yeah, Kevin, you can mouth off. You can hurt people's feelings. It can come across, right? Because some of you might think that I pick too hard on Ken. But Ken and I have a relationship that way, right? And if I try to pick on other people that way, right? And okay, one more story. So, and this is another real life Kevin story. This is a current work story. So I work at an engineering firm, and a coworker was doing a drawing, and I looked at it, made some comments. I'm like, oh well, you know, and I was kind of playing, is that the word? You know, just like I would with Ken Plummer, okay. But this person was a little more sensitive, okay, and I think it, and this is an excuse, but this person's female, okay, and so, no, I'm gonna watch this, okay, watch this. So men and women are different, okay. Now, and I know it's currently in the world that's like a dangerous thing to say, but check this out, and you check me if I'm wrong here, okay? If a man walks up to me and says, "Here, smell this," okay? It is going to be the grossest smell I've ever smelled in my entire life, right? I guarantee you, right? If you're a guy, right? If you tell a guy, "Hey, take a whiff of this," right? It's going to it's going to make your eyes hurt, right? And you're going to be, oh, okay. And if a woman says, "Hey, here, smell this," guess what? It's going to smell like daisies or flowers or something, right? Men and women are different, right? Because, well, I mean, just that example. It's like, no, it's totally different. And you know what I've learned, right? This is something I've learned. "Hey, Sharon, smell this," right? And she's a smell-oriented person, and she goes, "Ugh." And so now I've learned, you know, not to offer that kind of smell. You know what I'm saying? Men and women are different. I'm going to leave it at that. Okay, so back to my story, though. So what had happened is I was plumber playing with this person, okay? Well, and I was in their office, and I could tell that this individual was like, yikes, like full tilt, right? Upset with me, right? And I'm like, okay. And so just slowly back out, right? And then I immediately, you know, texted from my office to office away. I'm like, "Hey, I'm sorry," right? The sorry comes quick, right? Because, you know, I've gone down this road enough to know, oh yeah, I've screwed up enough to know that, you know, when you've wronged somebody, and it's a misunderstanding for sure, but still, you need to be quick to apologize. And I did. And, you know, there was a long text, and it ensued, and it talked about me bullying, right? And it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that was farthest from my intent, was bullying, right? Because some of you might say, "Boy, you sure bully Ken Plummer around." I'm like, have you seen that guy? He can take care of himself, right? That's not bullying. But listen, but if it's somebody that's not that same character, and, you know, that likes to smell pretty things and not nasty things, right? Okay, but guys don't like to smell nasty things. It's noteworthy. My point is that, right, recently something like that happened, the same kind of deal, and quick, immediately you nip that in the bud. And I didn't go to try to justify myself. Well, really, I'm like, no, I'm sorry, didn't mean to upset you, right? And things were fine. But that's how it's a constant working in our life, and it does tie in with the tongue, right? Yeah. Once again, the tongue got a little loose there, and some people can perceive that as bullying when it's not intended to be, but that's on me. It's not on them, right? Because there was a time in my life where I'd be like, well, it's their fault. They didn't understand me, right? My intentions were good, but it's their fault they didn't understand. And it's like, no, my intentions were good, but I just was misunderstood, and that's on me. It's not on them, right? the world doesn't need to adjust to me. I need to adjust to the world in some regards, right? To not be offensive in that way. All right. There's ways that are offensive that's okay. All right, here we go.
That was a long story.
Yeah, I know. If anyone thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his heart, his person's religion is worthless. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. And so we're going to stop there, and we're going to hit that a little bit next week. That as he's going through this, he says, all right, you need to bridle your tongue, you need to seek wisdom, you need to persevere under tribulation. And if this is all working, it says you're going to do things like visit orphans and widows in their affliction, and keep oneself unstained from the world. Okay, so we're going to look at that next week, and it's significant why he points out here that you need to visit widows and orphans, and we're going to talk about that next week. So the guys are going to start passing out the communion elements, and as we come to communion in this message, you know, it really, the opportunity for our souls to be prepared and able to withstand in tribulation is because of what Jesus did, right? And that whole looking in the mirror, when you look in the mirror, right, and you remember how wicked you are, right? It's hard, it should be hard, for you to hold something against somebody else that's wronged you. Right? There's a saying, and let me see if I can get it right, that it's a sorry state when I'm more offended by my neighbor's sin than I'm offended by my own sin. Right? So, if you walk with the Lord a long time, and you know you get things, different areas cleaned up, and you're not stumbling, and somebody next to you does something offensive, right? If you've really walked with the Lord long, you're like, oh, I remember that, right? And you're not offended by them, right? You're offended by the perhaps much significantly smaller thing that you've done in your own life, right? Because you realize, oh, I'm not there yet. Lord, you're continually working on my life. And so when you realize the only thing that allows you to be united with God is what this represents. And this represents Jesus' body that was broken, right? And it was broken for us, and his blood that was shed to pay the price for my sin. And so when I have that, when I remember that, when someone else has wronged me, it's a lot easier to be forgiving, right? Because, I'm there too, right? I'm in the same kind of situation that has nothing to do with me. And when Jesus went to the cross, we've talked about this many times, that it wasn't a mistake, it wasn't an accident, it wasn't like oops, they got me now. It was, this is the plan that I've always had, because God himself says, I want a relationship with Kevin, and the only way I can get it is to die for him. Okay? And the same thing applies to Ken, right? Believe it or not, with that big heart. It's all about Jesus. And so as we take this bread and this cup, we're going to, I want you to just reflect a little bit about that in your own life, right? Lord, is there anything that you need to condition in my heart? So what we're going to do is we're going to have a little bit of silence, and then just take it when you're ready. So like 30 seconds of silence. We'll all take it as the Lord moves on our heart, and then I'll pray at the end. And then if you haven't taken it till the end, then when I start praying, I better take this because everybody's going to be looking up in a minute. Does that make sense? Right? All right. So let's just seek the Lord in silence, and let's take this together.